The desert heat shimmered off the asphalt as Army veteran David Kane parked his Honda Civic outside the small office complex on Mesquite Street. 6 months since leaving the service after 3 tours in Iraq, and he was still adjusting to the quiet rhythm of civilian life in Nogales, Arizona. The transition from military intelligence analyst to small-town accountant was intentional. He wanted work that used his analytical skills without the constant pressure of battlefield intelligence operations. Staff Sergeant David Kane had spent 6 years in Army intelligence, specializing in financial analysis of insurgent networks. His unit had tracked terrorist funding, identified weapons smuggling operations, and disrupted enemy supply chains by following money trails through complex Middle Eastern banking systems. The work had been intense, meaningful, and occasionally dangerous when intelligence operations led to direct action missions. Now, at 32, David was learning to apply those same analytical skills to legitimate business operations in a border town where the biggest excitement was usually a delayed shipment of auto parts. Desert Vista Logistics occupied a modest suite on the second floor, sandwiched between a bail bondsman and a tax preparation service that only operated during tax season. The company specialized in freight coordination for small businesses moving goods across the U.S.-Mexico border, handling everything from agricultural exports to manufactured components for maquiladora factories. His boss, Maria Santos, had been immediately impressed when David mentioned his Army background during the job interview 6 months earlier. "We need someone detail-oriented who understands complex documentation," she'd said, reviewing his resume. Military intelligence training teaches exactly that kind of precision. The border business requires careful attention to customs regulations and shipping manifests. Maria had built Desert Vista from nothing over the past 15 years, starting as a one-woman operation coordinating shipments for local farmers and growing into a regional logistics company serving clients across Arizona and New Mexico. She was bilingual, knew every customs agent at the Nogales port of entry, and had built relationships with trucking companies on both sides of the border. "Morning, David," Maria called from her office as he settled at his desk and powered up his computer. At 62, she maintained the energy and attention to detail that had made her business successful. "How's the veteran adjustment going? I know civilian work can feel different after military service. It's good to use my analytical skills in a peaceful environment," David replied honestly. After years of tracking enemy financial networks where mistakes meant American soldiers died, there was something satisfying about ensuring legitimate businesses maintained proper documentation for legal cross-border commerce. David pulled up the monthly reconciliation reports, his military-trained eye automatically scanning for discrepancies and inconsistencies. In Iraq, he'd analyzed insurgent financial networks by looking for patterns in seemingly routine transactions. Money transfers that were slightly too large, shipping manifests that didn't quite align with vehicle capacities, fuel consumption that suggested hidden cargo. Those same skills translated directly to civilian logistics work. David's job was to reconcile shipping manifests with fuel costs, ensure customs documentation matched actual cargo descriptions, and verify that client invoices aligned with transportation expenses. The work required the same systematic attention to detail that had made him an effective intelligence analyst. But this Thursday morning in late October, something immediately triggered his veteran instincts. The shipping manifest for Southwestern Agricultural Solutions showed 47 pallets of fertilizer bound for Hermosillo, Mexico. Standard agricultural export, nothing unusual about the cargo description or destination. But when David cross-referenced the fuel consumption data from their trucking partner, Border Express Transport, the numbers didn't align with his experience. In the Army, David had learned that small discrepancies often revealed larger operational security breaches. Vehicle fuel consumption was a reliable indicator of actual payload weight, and David had used similar analysis in Iraq to identify insurgent vehicles carrying hidden weapons or explosives. The truck that had carried those 47 pallets of fertilizer had consumed diesel at a rate indicating maximum payload capacity, approximately 60,000 pounds gross vehicle weight. But 47 pallets of fertilizer should weigh roughly 18,000 pounds. That was a discrepancy of more than 20 tons. David's military training kicked in automatically. He began pulling additional shipping records, creating the kind of comprehensive data matrix he'd used to track weapons smuggling operations in Baghdad. The pattern that emerged was unmistakable and deeply troubling. Border Express transport was consistently burning fuel at rates suggesting their trucks carried significantly more weight than their shipping manifests indicated. This wasn't simple accounting error or sloppy record-keeping. This was systematic operational deception, and David's veteran instincts recognized it immediately. Over the next several hours, David expanded his analysis to include other Desert Vista clients. Southwestern Agricultural Solutions wasn't the only company with suspicious shipping patterns. Mountain States Import-Export showed similar discrepancies between declared cargo weights and actual fuel consumption. So did Rio Grande Trading Company and several other businesses that moved goods regularly between Arizona and Mexico. David pulled up corporate registration records and began tracing ownership structures, applying methodology he'd learned during counterterrorism operations. What he discovered was a sophisticated network of shell companies and limited partnerships designed to obscure actual ownership and control. Mountain States Import-Export was owned by a holding company registered in Delaware. That holding company was controlled by another entity incorporated in Nevada. Rio Grande Trading Company showed a similar ownership structure, with actual control obscured through multiple layers of corporate entities. In Iraq, David had seen identical patterns when analyzing terrorist financing networks. Insurgent groups used complex corporate structures to hide money flows and make it difficult for American intelligence to identify actual decision-makers and operational leaders. The businesses that Desert Vista served weren't just legitimate import-export companies with sloppy paperwork. They were part of a sophisticated money laundering operation, and David's veteran experience told him exactly who was likely behind it. David, Maria's voice interrupted his analysis. She stood in his doorway with a concerned expression. "Can you prepare the quarterly client summaries? I need them for our compliance review with customs authorities." "Of course," David replied, minimizing the spreadsheet he'd been working on. "Maria, I've noticed some fuel efficiency inconsistencies with several of our trucking partners. My military background makes me sensitive to operational discrepancies. Should I investigate further or just note them in the reports?" Maria stepped into his office and closed the door behind her, behavior that immediately reminded David of classified briefings in Iraq. "Your Army experience is valuable, David, and I appreciate the thoroughness you bring to this work. But sometimes in civilian business, we focus on our specific responsibilities and don't look too deeply into our clients' operations. Military precision is good for our internal processes, but we don't need to analyze everything our partners do." David nodded as if accepting guidance, but his veteran instincts were now fully alert. In Iraq, commanders had given similar warnings when intelligence analysts got too close to classified operations or sensitive political relationships. Maria's response felt like operational security guidance, not routine business advice. "I understand," David said. "Focus on accurate documentation of what we're directly responsible for." "Exactly. Our job is to coordinate shipments and ensure proper paperwork. What our clients do with their cargo after it crosses the border isn't our concern, as long as their documentation is accurate when they give it to us." After Maria left his office, David sat quietly for several minutes, processing what he'd heard and observed. Her explanation made sense from a civilian business perspective, but something about her demeanor suggested she knew more about the discrepancies than she was admitting. David's military experience had taught him to distinguish between legitimate operational security and criminal concealment. During his tours in Iraq, he'd worked with Iraqi government officials who were genuinely concerned about protecting sensitive information, and he'd also dealt with officials who were trying to hide their cooperation with insurgent groups. Maria's behavior felt more like the latter. That evening, David sat on the small balcony of his apartment, drinking beer and watching the sunset paint the Sonoran Desert in brilliant shades of orange and red. The beauty of the landscape contrasted sharply with the ugly possibilities he was beginning to consider about his workplace. His phone buzzed with a text from his former Army buddy Mike Rodriguez, who was now working as a federal agent with IC in El Paso. "How's civilian life treating you?" Missing the excitement of chasing bad guys, David stared at the message for several minutes before typing back, learning that some skills from military service translate better than expected. "What do you mean?" Mike responded. "Just that analytical training helps in any environment where you need to spot patterns and inconsistencies. Sounds like you found something interesting." Everything legit where you're working? David hesitated before responding, still figuring that out. Mike's next message came quickly. If you ever need to talk through anything work-related, you know I'm here. Federal agents always appreciate good intelligence from reliable sources. David appreciated the offer, but he wasn't ready to involve law enforcement yet. His military training had taught him the importance of developing comprehensive intelligence before taking any action. He needed to understand the full scope of what he was dealing with before he decided how to respond. Over the next week, David continued his analysis during lunch breaks and after regular business hours. He accessed public records, traced corporate filings, and slowly assembled a detailed picture of the network Desert Vista was serving. The money flows were sophisticated and clearly designed to obscure the original sources of funds. Cash-intensive businesses in Mexico would purchase services from American companies. Those American companies would then make investments in real estate, luxury goods, and other assets that could be easily liquidated. The drugs flowed north across the border, the money flowed south, and companies like Desert Vista provided the legitimate documentation that made it all appear legal. David realized he was looking at a money laundering operation serving the cartels that controlled drug trafficking through the Sonoran Desert Corridor. His veteran experience in tracking insurgent financial networks had prepared him to recognize exactly this kind of criminal infrastructure. The question now was what to do about it. In the Army, David had learned that intelligence without action was worthless, but he'd also learned that direct confrontation wasn't always the best tactical approach. Sometimes the most effective strategy was to provide intelligence to assets better positioned to act on it. His military training told him this wasn't a situation he could handle alone. The criminal organization he'd identified was sophisticated, well-funded, and undoubtedly dangerous. But David's analytical skills had uncovered evidence that could be devastating if it reached the right law enforcement agencies. As David sat on his balcony that Friday evening, watching the lights of Nogales begin to twinkle in the gathering darkness, he made his decision. Military service had taught him that some battles were worth fighting, even when they weren't officially his responsibility. David Kane, Army veteran and intelligence analyst, was going to war against the cartel. David Kane spent the weekend developing his operational plan with the same methodical approach he'd used for intelligence missions in Iraq. Military service had taught him that successful operations required careful preparation, multiple contingencies, and absolute operational security. Monday morning found him back at Desert Vista Logistics, maintaining his routine while internally preparing for what Army doctrine called an indirect approach to the target. Direct confrontation with the cartel would be suicidal. Walking into federal offices would expose him immediately and potentially alert the criminal network. But David's military intelligence background had taught him how to provide actionable intelligence to appropriate authorities without revealing sources or methods. The Drug Enforcement Administration field office in Tucson represented the logical operational authority for his intelligence, but David's approach would have to be more sophisticated than simply calling in tips. He needed to provide evidence that would prompt comprehensive investigation while protecting his position as an intelligence asset. Working late that Tuesday evening, David began implementing his plan. Using his legitimate credentials to access Border Express Transport's shipping database, he downloaded fuel consumption records, vehicle maintenance logs, and driver schedules spanning the previous 18 months. His military training had taught him how to extract intelligence from enemy systems without leaving traces that would alert security personnel. The data revealed patterns even more damning than David had initially suspected. Border Express trucks consistently passed through certain Border Patrol checkpoints during shift changes when staffing was minimal. They followed routes that avoided random inspection points, and their schedules aligned perfectly with known periods of reduced enforcement activity. David cross-referenced this information with public records of Border Patrol operations, building the kind of comprehensive intelligence picture he'd created for targeting insurgent networks in Iraq. What emerged was clear evidence that the trucking company wasn't just moving undeclared cargo. They were actively coordinating with corrupt officials to ensure safe passage for their shipments. Over the next week, David applied full military intelligence methodology to map the criminal network. He traced financial flows between shell companies, identified key personnel through corporate filings, and documented operational patterns that revealed the scope of the money laundering operation. The sophistication of what he uncovered reminded David of the most complex insurgent networks he'd analyzed during his military service. The cartel was moving millions of dollars monthly through a web of legitimate businesses, using classic money laundering techniques to integrate drug profits into the legal financial system. But David's veteran experience had also taught him about compartmentalized operations and need-to-know intelligence distribution. Instead of creating a single comprehensive report that might overwhelm investigators or compromise operational security, he prepared separate intelligence packages targeted to specific law enforcement agencies. Using secure communication methods learned during military service, David created anonymous intelligence reports for multiple federal agencies. To the Drug Enforcement Administration, he provided fuel consumption data and vehicle tracking information that clearly indicated Border Express trucks were carrying undeclared cargo. To the Internal Revenue Service, he submitted financial records showing cash transactions that exceeded federal reporting requirements and suggested systematic tax evasion. To Immigration and Customs Enforcement, he delivered shipping manifest discrepancies that indicated fraudulent customs declarations. Each report contained information specifically relevant to that agency's jurisdictional authority, formatted according to federal intelligence standards David had learned in the Army. The genius of this approach reflected David's military training in operational planning. Each agency would investigate independently, following their institutional procedures and legal authorities. But eventually, their separate investigations would intersect and create a comprehensive operational picture that no single agency could ignore. 2 weeks after David initiated his intelligence operation, the first signs of federal interest appeared. A black SUV with government plates parked across from Desert Vista's office building, its occupants conducting what David recognized as routine surveillance. The vehicle remained for 3 hours, with agents photographing everyone who entered or left the building. David's military experience allowed him to identify the surveillance immediately, but he maintained his civilian routine while mentally cataloging the federal response to his intelligence reports. Maria noticed the government vehicle as well, and David watched her behavior change throughout the day. She made several urgent phone calls in rapid Spanish, speaking quietly and frequently glancing toward the windows. Her demeanor reminded David of insurgent cell leaders in Iraq when they detected American intelligence gathering, nervous, hypervigilant, and clearly implementing damage control protocols. "David," Maria called him into her office late that afternoon. "I need you to prepare some modified client reports for our quarterly compliance review. Your military attention to detail will be valuable for this." "What kind of modifications?" David asked. "I want you to run billing summaries for the past 6 months, but exclude any entries related to Border Express Transport, Mountain States Import-Export, and Rio Grande Trading Company. Focus on our smaller agricultural clients." David understood immediately. Maria was sanitizing records to create plausible deniability, removing the most obviously suspicious transactions from their official documentation. This was basic operational security, confirming beyond doubt that she knew exactly what kind of business Desert Vista was really facilitating. "That will make our revenue numbers significantly lower than actual," David pointed out. "I understand the impact on our numbers. Just prepare the reports as I requested." That evening, David made secure copies of all original records before they could be altered or destroyed. His Army intelligence training had emphasized the importance of preserving evidence for follow-up operations and potential legal proceedings. The pressure on the criminal network intensified over the following weeks. Border Express Transport canceled several scheduled shipments without explanation, behavior suggesting they were trying to reduce their operational exposure. Southwestern Agricultural Solutions and other client companies requested expedited processing for existing orders, indicating they wanted to move their operations before law enforcement could establish comprehensive surveillance. Maria's routine changed dramatically. She started leaving work early, taking extended lunch breaks, and making frequent trips to meetings she described vaguely as client consultations. David recognized this as coordination activity. She was clearly communicating with other elements of the criminal network to manage their response to increasing federal attention. David maintained his civilian accountant cover while carefully documenting every suspicious activity. His military experience had taught him that successful operations required patience and systematic intelligence collection, even when the operational tempo was accelerating around him. 3 weeks after the first surveillance appearance, David arrived at work to find Desert Vista Logistics completely surrounded by federal agents. DEA, ICE, and FBI vehicles filled the parking lot, while tactical teams in body armor carried boxes of evidence from the building. The operation reminded David of the precision raids he'd supported during his military service, executed with overwhelming force and perfect coordination. Maria Santos stood in handcuffs beside a black government SUV, her civilian business cover completely blown. Her face showed the defeated resignation David had seen in captured insurgent leaders who realized their operational security had been fatally compromised. Agent Jennifer Walsh approached David as he stood beside his Honda Civic, studying the federal law enforcement operation with obvious professional interest. "Mr. Kane, I'm Agent Walsh, Drug Enforcement Administration. We understand you're a military veteran who worked here as an accountant." "Yes, ma'am." Staff Sergeant David Kane, Army Intelligence, 3 tours in Iraq. "I've been working civilian accounting since my discharge 6 months ago." Agent Walsh studied his face carefully, clearly evaluating his responses and demeanor. "Your military background would give you analytical skills to recognize operational irregularities. Did you notice anything unusual about Desert Vista's business operations?" David provided carefully measured responses that demonstrated his capabilities without revealing the full extent of his intelligence operation. He explained about the fuel consumption discrepancies and suspicious corporate structures, presenting himself as a veteran whose military training had helped him notice patterns that civilian accountants might miss. "Your Army experience was clearly valuable in identifying these problems," Walsh observed. "The irregularities you noticed were actually indicators of a sophisticated money laundering operation serving the Sonora cartel." "I suspected something wasn't legitimate," David replied truthfully. "Military intelligence training teaches you to recognize when operational patterns don't match official explanations." "Would you be willing to provide testimony about your observations during Desert Vista's operations?" "Absolutely. Military service taught me the importance of supporting legitimate authorities against criminal organizations that threaten American communities." Agent Walsh nodded approvingly. "We'll be in touch about testimony requirements as this investigation develops. In the meantime, consider yourself unemployed. Desert Vista Logistics is now a federal crime scene." As David drove home that afternoon, he felt the professional satisfaction of a successful military operation. The intelligence he'd developed and provided had prompted exactly the federal response he'd intended. Maria Santos, Border Express Transport, and the entire money laundering network were now facing federal prosecution. But David's military experience had also taught him that individual victories were just tactical successes in much larger strategic conflicts. The Sonora cartel would adapt to this setback, develop new money laundering methods, and continue their operations through different front companies and logistics networks. David's war against the cartels was just beginning. Over the following months, David watched the federal case unfold with the detached professional interest of a veteran intelligence analyst observing the results of a successful operation. The investigation he'd initiated through careful application of military methodology had expanded far beyond Desert Vista Logistics into a comprehensive takedown of cartel financial infrastructure across Arizona and New Mexico. Media coverage portrayed the bust as a masterpiece of federal law enforcement investigation. DEA officials held press conferences highlighting the sophisticated techniques they'd used to penetrate the money laundering network. FBI representatives praised the interagency cooperation that had made the operation possible. Politicians promised increased resources for border security and drug interdiction efforts. David read these reports with the professional understanding that public narratives rarely reflected operational realities. The federal agents were receiving credit for investigative work that had largely consisted of following intelligence leads he'd provided through anonymous channels. But that was exactly how successful military intelligence operations worked. The analysts who developed crucial intelligence rarely received public recognition for their contributions. Agent Walsh contacted David periodically during the investigation, requesting clarification about specific financial transactions and asking him to provide testimony at grand jury proceedings. David cooperated fully, always presenting himself as a veteran accountant whose military training had helped him notice suspicious patterns in routine business records. Your Army intelligence background was obviously valuable in recognizing these irregularities, Walsh commented during one of their meetings. Most civilian accountants wouldn't have the analytical skills to identify money laundering operations at this level of sophistication. Military service teaches systematic analysis, David replied. You learn to look for patterns that don't match official explanations. The trials began the following spring, with David testifying at multiple proceedings as prosecutors built comprehensive cases against the criminal network. Maria Santos accepted a plea agreement and received 8 years in federal prison for money laundering charges. The owners of Border Express Transport were convicted of drug trafficking conspiracy after federal investigators discovered cocaine residue in their trucks and received sentences ranging from 15 to 25 years. Several government officials were also prosecuted, including a Border Patrol supervisor who'd been receiving $50,000 monthly to provide cartel representatives with information about checkpoint schedules and enforcement operations. His conviction demonstrated that David's intelligence had exposed not just criminal organizations, but also the corruption that enabled their activities. Throughout the legal proceedings, David maintained perfect operational security. He found employment at another accounting firm in Tucson, processed routine business transactions for legitimate clients, and lived quietly as a veteran building a new civilian career. His military background was known and respected by colleagues, but nobody suspected his role in dismantling one of the region's most sophisticated criminal networks. Defense attorneys tried various strategies to discredit David's testimony, suggesting he was an attention-seeking ex-soldier or implying that his military service had made him paranoid and prone to seeing conspiracies where none existed. But David's quiet professionalism, genuine service record, and detailed knowledge of financial analysis made these attacks completely ineffective. Staff Sergeant Kane served his country with distinction in Iraq, federal prosecutor Amanda Morrison stated during closing arguments in Maria's trial. His military intelligence training equipped him to recognize criminal patterns that others missed. Without his observations and willingness to cooperate with law enforcement, this dangerous organization would still be operating. David listened to these statements with mixed feelings. The recognition was gratifying, but his military experience had taught him that the most important victories often happened without public acknowledgement. The real measure of success wasn't courtroom praise, but the concrete results achieved through professional competence and dedication to mission accomplishment. On a warm evening in June, exactly 18 months after he'd first noticed the suspicious fuel consumption reports, David received an unexpected visit from Agent Walsh. She appeared at his apartment carrying 2 bottles of beer and wearing civilian clothes instead of her usual federal agent attire. "Mind if we talk?" she asked. Veteran to veteran. "I did 6 years Navy intelligence before joining DEA." They sat on David's small balcony overlooking the desert, sharing the comfortable camaraderie that often developed between military veterans who'd served in similar roles. "The investigation is officially closed," Walsh informed him. "All major players convicted, criminal organization completely dismantled, $47 million in assets seized and forfeited to the federal government." "Outstanding results," David replied with genuine satisfaction. Walsh studied his face in the fading desert light. "David, I've worked with hundreds of witnesses and cooperative sources during my career. Most veterans who stumble across criminal activity either ignore it or report it through official channels immediately. They don't conduct comprehensive intelligence operations and deliver perfectly targeted analytical products to multiple agencies." David maintained steady eye contact, his expression neutral. "Your testimony was too detailed, too precise," Walsh continued. "You knew exactly what questions we'd ask and had exactly the right answers prepared. That suggests either remarkable intuition or professional intelligence training applied systematically over an extended period." David sipped his beer without responding. "Look, I don't need confirmation of what I already understand," Walsh said. "But whoever initiated this investigation was a professional who knew how to develop actionable intelligence and deliver it effectively to appropriate law enforcement authorities. The anonymous tips that started our investigation were textbook intelligence products, comprehensive, well-sourced, and strategically distributed to maximize investigative response. David appreciated her professional recognition but maintained his operational security protocols. "I'm saying thank you," Walsh continued. "Military veterans like you bring unique capabilities to fighting criminal organizations that threaten American communities." The Sonora cartel lost a major revenue stream. Dozens of corrupt officials are in federal prison, and drug trafficking through this corridor has been significantly disrupted because someone with your skills decided that military service doesn't end with discharge. They sat in comfortable silence, two intelligence professionals sharing mutual respect for competent operational work. "There's something else I wanted to discuss," Walsh said finally. "We've identified similar financial patterns in other border communities. El Paso, McAllen, San Diego. Complex money laundering operations that would require someone with military intelligence background to fully understand and effectively counter." David understood what she was suggesting. "Agent Walsh, I'm just a veteran trying to build a stable civilian career." "Of course you are," she replied with a slight smile. "But if that veteran accountant ever notices operational irregularities in his future work, I hope he'll remember that some missions continue after military service officially ends." After Walsh left, David sat on his balcony until late into the night, considering the conversation and its implications. The agent's visit had been professional courtesy, acknowledgement of his contribution without requiring explicit admission. But it had also been unofficial recruitment, an invitation to continue applying his military skills against criminal organizations operating across the Southwest. The following morning, David submitted his resignation to the Tucson accounting firm. He'd completed his mission in the Nogales area, and his veteran instincts told him it was time to move to the next operational environment where his skills could be effectively employed. He sold his furniture, closed his bank accounts, and settled his apartment lease. On a warm Tuesday evening in late June, David loaded his minimal possessions onto a black Triumph motorcycle and prepared to leave Arizona. As he rode north through the desert darkness, the lights of Tucson fading in his mirrors, David thought about how military service had prepared him for this unconventional form of continued national service. In Iraq, he'd sometimes been frustrated by bureaucratic constraints that prevented him from acting on intelligence that could have saved American lives. Here in civilian society, he'd found a way to apply his military skills with greater operational freedom and more direct results. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, disappearing into darkness beyond his motorcycle's headlight beam. David didn't know his specific destination, but he understood his mission parameters clearly. Criminal networks operated throughout border regions. Sophisticated money laundering operations needed attention from someone with his military intelligence background, and corrupt officials required the kind of systematic investigation that veterans like him could provide. Somewhere in Phoenix, families were safer tonight because cartel money was frozen in federal accounts instead of buying weapons for street violence. Somewhere in Tucson, teenagers would live to graduate high school because the drugs that might have killed them were now secured in evidence lockers instead of sold at local schools. David measured operational success in these invisible victories. Military service had taught him that the most important battles often happened without recognition or reward, fought by professionals who understood that duty to country continued regardless of official assignment or public acknowledgement. The motorcycle hummed steadily through the night, carrying him toward whatever operational challenge awaited him next. Behind him, the lights of Arizona disappeared into desert darkness, but the mission continued. Other veterans were fighting different battles in different ways, but they shared the same fundamental commitment to protecting American communities from those who would harm them. In the silence of the Sonoran desert, veteran David Kane smiled grimly and twisted the throttle, accelerating into the darkness toward his next assignment. Military service had officially ended, but his war against the cartels was just beginning. The silent counter had found his calling, and America's enemies would learn to fear the quiet professionals who served without recognition, fought without fanfare, and won without glory. Justice didn't always wear a uniform, but it always carried the heart of a soldier.